First, I'd like to thank Ulrich for having, especially Professor Krishna here for several days, and for having this very distinguished panel. Ulrich works very hard to make these annual events possible, and not everyone here comes every year, but he tries to make this a tradition, and it is very important because it is one way that we continue our dialogue about education and about a lot of things that we've discussed in Krishnamurti's teachings and philosophy. We have people who are obviously extremely qualified to talk about these things, and Ulrich makes it possible. These three gentlemen have a lot in common, actually. Two were plucked by Krishnamurti and asked to head teaching centers, schools, start schools. And the third gentleman, Dr. Rueben Weininger, is someone who was a student at Brockwood Park. So he's the most interesting specimen on the panel. But let me back up. I'm Adele Shabelsky. I've lived in Ojai, and I was not one of the people who moved to Ojai because of Krishnamurti. I moved here because my husband and I fell in love with Ojai. But I was fortunate enough to meet Krishnamurti, and over the years I've actually learned to appreciate so much more everything that Krishnamurti talked about. And it's people like Professor Krishna who have made it possible to understand more and go a little bit deeper into Krishnamurti's teachings and philosophy. Professor Krishna and his wife are here from India, and Professor Krishna is a retired professor of physics from the University of Benares. He's an author of various books, too many to mention here: Science and Spirituality, The Holistic Perception of Reality, The Pursuit of Happiness, and Krishnamurti as I Knew Him. And I know that he's working on something else. Professor Krishna is the trustee of Krishnamurti Foundation, and is in charge of Rajgat Educational Study Center. Rajgat Educational Center has a school for poor children. It has a school from the first grade to all the way through the 12th grade, and a women's college. David Moody was the first teacher at the Oak Grove School. Krishnamurti invited him to come to Ojai, and David basically had to change his whole life. And his sister is here from Virginia, and she can attest to that David came to Ojai, became the first teacher and director of the school, educational director, and later director of the school. Recently, David has published a very important book. The book is The Unconditioned Mind, the Oak Grove School, and Krishnamurti. And David has started writing a blog for the Huffington Post. And Dr. Rueben Weininger, has training and was in internal medicine. And I remembered that you were in internal medicine before Rueben got into psychiatry. And Rueben went to Northwestern University. David went to UCLA. David has a master's in science and a PhD in education. Rueben went to Northwestern University, got his medical degree there, and practiced psychiatry at the Neuropsychiatric Institute of St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco. He did yoga training in Chennai, India, and Rueben practices general psychiatry with emphasis on integration of a yoga theory and practice, as well as psychodynamic psychotherapy. I'm going to ask each panelist to talk a little bit about education. What is the intention of education? Why was Krishnamurti so concerned about education? What does it mean for us to be educated? I just want to read something to you before I ask David to continue. Krishnamurti said, "To learn about meditation, you have to see how your mind is working. You have to watch as you watch a lizard going by, walking across the wall. You see all its 4 feet, how it sticks to the wall, and as you watch, you see all the movements. In the same way, watch your thinking. Do not correct it. Do not suppress it. Do not say, all this is too difficult. Just watch. Watch thought, the way it runs, one thought after another. So you begin to learn to observe. Once you begin to learn, there is no end to learning." So obviously, Krishnamurti was talking about a different kind of learning. So David, if you could start, and then we'll have Rueben follow you, and then as we agreed that the heavy weight on the panel will pull it all together. So David, please.
Okay, thank you, Adele, for such a lovely introduction. And thanks to Ulrich for facilitating and making all this happen, really. My understanding of the theme of our panel discussion was slightly different than the way Adele expressed it. I think our intention was to discuss not just education in general or Krishnamurti education, but a little bit more specific topic, which is insight in education. In any case, that's what I came prepared to discuss. So the way I'd like to frame this is, having worked for quite a few years in Oak Grove School and tried to understand Krishnamurti philosophy and how to implement it in a day school for kids K through 12. It was a little bit puzzling because Krishnamurti's philosophy goes very, very deep in a psychological sense, and it's not always clear how that translates into a classroom with 3rd graders or 7th graders or whatever. So that's the kind of issue that I puzzled over all the time that I was at the school and also subsequently. And after reflecting, it seems to me that the educational or psychological phenomenon or moment of insight is a very helpful avenue for linking the grand themes of Krishnamurti educational philosophy with the actual practical actualities of life in the classroom. And I'm going to try to show you how I see that connection. But in order to understand insight, I think we have to think of insight simultaneously with how we think about knowledge. Because knowledge and insight, especially as they have been examined by not only Krishnamurti, but especially in his conversations with David Bohm, knowledge and insight, we don't ordinarily necessarily distinguish too sharply between those. But in Krishnamurti's discussions with Bohm, there's really quite a great gulf between knowledge and insight. And we have to get in touch with that distinction in order to see the kind of the unique beauty and relevance of insight, and what a great place it has in any educational setting, not just a school that aspires to be a Krishnamurti school, but any school can tune in to the nature of insight and cultivate it in the classroom. And that's what I'd like to try to show you today. So I'm going to begin by trying to elucidate that distinction between knowledge and insight, and begin by talking about quite a well-known in educational circles, in science education in particular. There's a pretty well-known documentary study where somebody went, this is I think in the late 1980s, somebody went to the day that the seniors at Harvard University were graduating, with all the pomp and circumstance you can imagine. And after the seniors had gotten their diploma and the ceremony was over, this little documentary crew interviewed a few of them. And in this documentary, student after student is standing there with their, their little diploma graduation cap on. And the person who's conducting the documentary interview asks them to explain something which is a standard part of the science curriculum in elementary school, not to mention high school, college. Ask them to explain, why does planet Earth have seasons? Why do we have spring, summer, fall, winter? What causes that? What brings that about? And these Harvard seniors, one after another, they say, the reason that happens is because, when the Earth rotates around the sun, we ordinarily think of it as a perfect circle, but it's not. The orbit around the sun is actually a little bit elliptical. And so there are times of the year when the Earth is farther away from the sun and times when it's closer. And that's what causes the seasons. When we're farther away, we have winter. When we're closer, we have summer. And one after another, there are 3 or 4 different students who get exactly the same answer. And this is an error in knowledge. Okay, this is factually not the case. The seasons are caused by something completely different. It's true that Earth's orbit around the sun is not quite a perfect circle, but that has very, very little to do with the seasons. Seasons are caused by the fact that Earth rotates on its axis, and the plane, the line from the North Pole to South Pole, is tilted by about 23 degrees from the plane of Earth's orbit around the sun. And it's that tilt that causes Earth to have greater or lesser amounts of sunlight on the northern and southern hemispheres throughout the year. So how does this connect with the question of insight? Well, these students, they have a wrong piece of knowledge when they think Earth's orbit is elliptical. And then you could replace that knowledge with another piece of knowledge which happens to be accurate, and you could say, well, no, that's not really it's really the tilt in the axis of rotation that causes the seasons. So now they have another piece of knowledge which is accurate to replace their inaccurate knowledge, but it's still all in the realm of knowledge. These are facts. One fact is wrong, one fact is correct, but it's just knowledge. We don't get to insight until something else happens, and that is, we have to see a whole set of relationships. We have to see how that tilt in the axis of rotation, how that relates to the plane of Earth's orbit around the sun, and how that causes different amounts of sunlight to fall on the northern and southern hemispheres. We have to see how all that fits together. And when you see how that fits together, then you have a aha moment. Then you say, oh, now I get it. I see a pattern of relationships which makes sense and explains a whole constellation of facts all at once. And that's what I call insight. That's a pretty simple example, but it's a little bit different than just having a piece of knowledge which may be accurate or inaccurate. It's a matter of seeing a set of relationships. And that moment of seeing, that moment of perception, that insight, I think is close to what Krishnamurti is talking about when he is speaking in the psychological field about insight. And if you study the school curriculum, you can see many, many moments of this kind. Another one, I've taught a lot of mathematics, and students, when they come to negative numbers, they often stumble because, we're very deeply conditioned to think that addition, adding, means increase, and subtraction obviously means decrease, diminish. But when you get to negative numbers, it doesn't quite work that way. If you start with the number 10 and you add a negative 2 to 10, it doesn't diminish, it increases. 10 plus negative, if you subtract, 10 take away negative 2 is 12. So it doesn't diminish as we expect with subtraction, it increases. Now again, a student can learn that fact as a piece of knowledge, as a rule, which they memorize, which is what most of them do. Or if they are able to look more deeply into the situation and get a sense of the meaning of subtraction and the meaning of a negative number, they can see for themselves why subtracting a negative number results in an increase. And that's an insight. It's a little bit different than just having the rule and applying the rule mechanically. Another interesting case with negative numbers is, we think of adding and multiplication as being very similar processes. We think of them both as resulting in an increase, and multiplication is even taught as repeated addition. So we think of them as being very much alike. But if you have two negative numbers and you add them, you get another negative number. But if you have two negative numbers and you multiply them, you get a positive number. So again, that's rather puzzling, and you can either accept that as a fact, as a rule, and apply it mechanically, which is what most students do, or you can think about the meaning of addition, the meaning of multiplication, the meaning of negative numbers, and see for yourself why one goes in one direction and the other goes in the other direction. That's an insight. And once you begin to tune into that distinction between knowledge and insight, the school curriculum is filled with opportunities of this kind to cultivate that unique kind of seeing or perception. But this distinction is not commonly recognized in schools. And I think it's a pity, because insight is what transforms a piece of knowledge from something just inert into something living and interesting and meaningful. Now, you might not necessarily agree that this is the same kind of insight that Krishnamurti is referring to, but I really kind of think that it is. There's a passage in this book, Truth and Actuality, which has several dialogues with David Bohm, and they go into this issue, the distinction between knowledge and insight at some length. And Krishnamurti is especially concerned with the question of, if I have an insight, how do I transmit it? How do I convey it to someone else? And he uses as an example, he says, we can observe that, a great many people have a belief in God. But if you look into that, it's not too hard to see that the belief in God is just a projection. He says it's a projection of our desires and images. And to realize that, he says, is an insight. And he says, once you have that insight, then if you yourself have that belief, it will drop away immediately. You'll instantly see the falseness of it and won't be caught in that anymore. And I submit that kind of insight is although it's in a different realm, it fundamentally is of a piece with the kind of insight that you can have in science or mathematics or any other field. And so that insight provides a point of contact between the large themes of Krishnamurti philosophy and the actual daily practicalities of life in the classroom. And again, I think this is something that any school can investigate and learn to cultivate, and I wish they would. I think it would enliven and rejuvenate education in all fields, not just Krishnamurti schools, but generally. And so that's my sense, Adele, of the relationship between insight and education. And I leave this to more insightful minds than mine to elaborate.
Well, I asked Rueben, I was so excited about Rueben speaking to us because Rueben went to Brockwood and grew up basically with Krishnamurti's philosophy, not only as far as being educated, but also having a father who very much respected Krishnamurti and his teachings, and actually moved to California from Washington, D.C. because after he met Krishnamurti. So I thought that because Rueben has integrated actually quite a bit of what he's learned into his life, I thought it would be fascinating for us to hear what he's done with that. And that was his assignment.
So how much time should I give?
As much as you'd like, I'll stop you when I think it's okay.
Well, thanks. When I was running this morning and thinking about how to put this together, and I realized that when I think about education, it's really the years at Brockwood that formulated for me what education and what learning really is, and that there's been a carryover, and I didn't realize it till later in my life, toward the work that I do now. It's really heavily guided and shaped by what happened at Brockwood. And I thought maybe one way to explore it would be to describe what Brockwood was like for a young person. This is back in the early 1970s. And as Adele said, my family had been connected to Krishnamurti. My father had brought Krishnamurti into the group of psychoanalysts who at that time were very active in the Washington area, including Erich Fromm and Frieda von Reichmann and Karen Horney and Harry Stack Sullivan, who were all interpersonal theorists, but they all responded to Krishnamurti. They felt he was speaking their language, and so there was a real brotherly or sisterly feeling there. So I came to Brockwood, and the first experience being there was something I would call space, and I think this is something I use with my patients now, the idea of space. The place itself is spacious. It has, physically, there's grounds that go on in all directions. Your eye doesn't settle on something very close, but there's pastures off in the distance. It's very easy to leave the main buildings and find yourself surrounded by nature, and it's a kind of space where you can be alone if you choose to, but you don't have to. There's a lot of community that you find when you enter the doors, and easily you can be alone. So I once, with my teacher in India, which I'll come to, I asked him a question, and he wrote on a piece of paper 2 words. He wrote space and no expectations. This was an answer. I don't remember what the question was, but that was the answer. So that resonates a little bit with this first theme, which is the idea that the starting of learning is to have space. And I'll go into more of that later. And in that space, there's a chance to explore something called solitude, or you could also call it aloneness. And according to the great British psychoanalyst Winnicott, the capacity to be alone, to develop the capacity to be alone, is one of the starting points of emotional health. So it's very easy in the world as it is now to not have aloneness, because we're often surrounded by stimulation. If there's a moment free, people will go to their iPhones or their computers. So the idea that you would cultivate and spend time actually walking alone or reflecting alone was part of that, setting the tone for an education. The next, and the lack of overstimulation is another thing that environment provides, that you really are encouraged in an environment like that. We didn't have computers back then, but even now, I've been there recently, the students are not allowed to have their computers except at very special times. So to reduce the amount of stimulation, I use this with my patients too, because often, and that has to do with practice, how we need to limit our exposure to ongoing stimulation in the form of entertainment or media or even conversation sometimes. The next point that I think is remarkable about Rockwood is beauty. And I know beauty sounds kind of frivolous in a way, but I think it's fundamental to health. It's fundamental to an atmosphere where people can feel kind toward each other, can feel warmth toward themselves, can feel connected to the world in a positive way. So this environment is beautiful, and it's aesthetically beautiful. The trees, the meadows, the people actually who go there, there's not just physically but internally have a certain beauty about them. Krishnamurti used to call it the aroma that comes off of a person, and he didn't mean the smell, but the flavor like a flower would have. And that also connects to the idea of an engagement with the natural world. At Rockwood, you are working out in the fields, in the meadows, you're working in this gigantic organic garden, so there's a very direct connection to nature and also to food because you're growing a good deal of it yourself. The next aspect of education that I think Rockwood represents is the idea of freedom from authority. And this is very atypical for a school. And the idea that each person could cultivate a capacity to see for themselves. It's really profound. And it starts with a radical rejection of all beliefs, all authority, all expertise in a certain sense. And the idea that every belief that we tend to want to gravitate toward is a movement of thought based in fear. This is something that really became clear to me, and I think to a lot of other people while we were at Rockwood, is that every belief, it doesn't matter what it is based on fear. And so if you're not afraid, there's not really a need to hold on to beliefs. And that insight, wisdom, happiness have really nothing to do with beliefs at all. And to create an environment where there is no belief and there's no authority is one of the starting points for genuine education.